up, people? You saw the title. We're to No, not really, but this video will be extremely racist. I wasn't kidding about the thumbnail. We're not actually gonna have fornication though. I just really don't like elves. Have a pretty big bone to pick with them. I've had a bone to pick with them for a long time because I think that after Tolkien did his thing, it was kind of unique. Everyone made them extremely boring and really over-sexualized. So starting with elves specifically, this video is going to cover several things that just kind of like irk me a little bit about fantasy in general. But the first one, we're going to start with the elves. It's always the elves, and it's always starting with Tolkien. As we know, Tolkien popularized elves, dwarves, and humans, and orcs. Those four have kind of been like the fantasy staple ever since. In most media, anime especially, for some reason, which is a little ironic, but regardless. Don't get me wrong, elves are cool, but they have some flaws when they're taken outside of Lord of the Rings. Most of the time, people keep the whole living for 1,000-year thing, but don't keep the rest of the lore, and they don't really think about how elven things actually affect the world that they're in. They kind of just like, oh, really old people who are like bitter with a stick up their ass, let's just shove them into anything and that'll work. They don't think about, okay, how does the world react to having 1,000-year-old beings? Why aren't elves conquering everybody if they're just like better at everything and don't have any limitations on them? I know a lot of people like to put like, oh, well, the birth rate is really low because elves just don't like having sex as much as anything else in the animal kingdom for reasons. Now, I know Tolkien had a lot of lore to make the elves make sense, but most of the time that same care isn't taken when elves are just slapped in anything else, and it ends up just being this like repetitive cycle of like, oh, that's an elf, they're agile, they have pointy ears, every single one of them is extremely attractive, and they live a long time, and they're usually better at magic, which is something that I think both Lord of the Rings and then later D&D contributed to, both of those kind of gaining popularity in the fantasy space. But my bone to pick here in this video isn't just elves. It's kind of all of them. Like dwarves, hello cat. Dwarves, orcs, really all common fantasy races have really stagnated, in my opinion, since fantasy kind of started becoming popular 25 years ago. Once TSR actually made D&D and, Lord of the Rings is coming out and it's picking up all this notion, I've seen very few solid innovations on these fantasy race ideas. And the first point to that is really that most fantasy races aren't even, they're kind of just reskinned humans. Like they just take relatable human ailments and apply it to an entire species. So if you're basically have a fantasy world, a lot of what the authors and show writers and animators do is they'll just take this idea of like, okay, an elf is wise and kind of like this thing, and they'll just like apply it to the entire species of elves, and then apply that to the entire species of dwarves and so on, so that instead of having to come up with unique characters for each of them, it's like, okay, well, a human is this guy, and an orc is this guy, and a dark elf is this guy, and a tiefling is Rule 34. I think going about it this way is really boring and reduces a lot of options. One example I can think of that's kind of, pretty popular is the Elder Scrolls series. I think a lot of the characters in that entire game series are just pretty much like the racial stereotype of specifically that race. Like if you talk to an orc, they're always going to have a certain set of characteristics. If you talk to a dark elf, they're always like this. If you talk to a Khajiit, his hand's always in your pocket. Like it's just a stereotype that's pushed forward repeatedly instead of making interesting characters for each. And I think that that's okay to an extent. Like if a species has a certain trait that leans towards a cultural tradition or value being formed out of it, then that makes sense. But you still have to have diverse people inside of them instead of just varying humanoids or human animals, essentially, in most cases, that aren't really interesting. They're just reskinned characters. I'll be the first to admit I don't read a lot, so I don't know if new modern fantasy doesn't write this problem in as much, but video games, anime, and from what I've seen of shows and movies, they still definitely do these things. Video games are kind of an interesting one for me because I feel like that would be one of the perfect locations to have very interesting humanoids. And going further than video games, tabletop games, which at least for video games, having similar humanoid characters and species at least makes sense from like a modeling standpoint because it takes time to model all of those things. But for a TTRPG, it's make believe. There's no cost to doing that. There may be like an extra addendum rule on the fact that like this armor can't fit this creature, so it cost some conversion to do it. But there's just no reason for every single species in most tabletop games to just be a humanoid creature. Or if they aren't humanoid creatures, they don't really dive deeply into the rules and really change the core fundamentals. Like Pathfinder 2nd Edition, for example, has these like celestial tree people that are basically rocks inside of wood. And you would think that like someone who doesn't have flesh and bone and whatnot has like vastly different rules than someone else, but they didn't really write that much for it. You're just kind of like a PC. There's some traits that differ it, but you're not completely different. They don't take it all the way out. And I understand there's balancing reasons in there, but also like this is a tabletop make-believe game. Like let's do something interesting here. Let's really make it actually crazy and make it kind of fun to delve into and completely foreign. One point I see a lot is relatability. I can see this, like relatability. You have to make characters that are relatable to us, the human actually reading it. But I think it's possible to do this without being human. There's plenty of movies like, I think it's District 9. Like you feel bad for the aliens because they still share human emotion. Like you can empathize with these creatures, but they're clearly not human in any regard. Like we can shake things up enough so that we're still relatable on a foundational level, but they're not just like, oh, hey, it's just like a humanoid creature and then the females are in bikini armor again. Good job. And this is, again, races are just a part of it because I think fantasy in general has fallen into this huge just pit of like European fantasy with a certain amount of fantasy races. Usually it's the big three, the dwarves, the elves, and the humans, and there's most likely orcs somewhere. Sometimes the orcs are good, sometimes you're supposed to kill them all. Most of the time there's a goblin involved somewhere, which at least, I mean, I can kind of understand goblins are always fun, but it's always Europe. We're always in Europe and the same non-existent time period because there's like 400 years of tech happening at the same time if you really look into the historics of it. And very few modules, video games, shows, movies, anime actually take you outside of this medieval European setting and explore other things. I mean, I can think of a few, at least on the anime side. I know like Egyptian themes or Middle Eastern themes can be kind of popular at times, but for video games, there's very few. Maybe like I can think of like a couple. I guess Assassin's Creed's gone to a couple interesting locations for whatever that's worth from Ubisoft. And typically we follow the same government structure as well. Like there's kings vying for power and there's a bunch of guilds that are involved. And we're pretty much just like doing some variation of the Elder Scrolls or Game of Thrones all the time. I'm not saying these things are bad, but it is just like a repeated theme that is constant through a lot of things. And I think that the fantasy genre in general could use like a boost of creativity and a new direction. Like not everything fantasy has to have elves and dwarves in it. Like we cannot have elves and dwarves in our games and be okay. Even I myself, I'm making a TTRPG called Stars of Odin Flame. It doesn't have elves and dwarves in it. It did originally, because I felt like I had to, in like a knee-jerk compulsive reaction. Like I was scared that people would be like mad that they're not there. But finally I said, I'm like, no, I don't want them. I don't want to see them. I don't want to see elves. I don't want to see dwarves. I want to do something new. I want to write campaigns that are in a new setting that's not just another king with another set of guilds. And I do want to say, I think a big part, at least in the tabletop world, is that D&D has dominated it for so long that is also just now the status quo. And it's gotten to the point where if you're me and you're trying to actually find resources outside of European fantasy, either they don't exist when you're looking for things like character art or certain creatures, or it's hard to find because they are also stereotyped into their own thing. Like anything in South America is typically Aztec or something like that. Anything in Egypt is very like Pharaoh, mummy. Asia is just weeb land. The only weeb stuff over there. Editor me here wanting to point out that while searching for art for my last campaign, which involved a lot of like islander kind of South American, almost like Caribbean vibes, and obviously a lot of the characters were that ethnic descent, finding art was pretty much impossible. And I actually found an image that someone had commissioned someone to make, which was a goose woman with massive double D slammers on her chest, which doesn't even biologically make sense because geese don't do that. They don't feed milk to their young. So like, why? But also it's a D&D subreddit, so of course I found that. Anyway. And in terms of finding, modules or third-party content that kind of steps out of this, it can be difficult to find different like ethnic factions, I feel, that really explore other cultures. Gods of the Forbidden North is one that I know is pretty good online, that has a more kind of Norse style faction system at least, but even that seems to be mostly in the European thing. It just has really well built religions throughout it. And I think I'll wrap this all up with just kind of saying that like overall, it's sort of just a man yelling at clouds video. Like I don't have a solution for this. It's just something I've noticed and that I figured I would make a statement on and maybe encourage other people to develop their own fantasy races that like don't follow the same status quo all the time and be more free to step outside of that. But at the end of the day, too, supply is always determined by demand. So like if people just want this more, then it will just be this way until people stop buying it. Which, who knows? We could see medieval European fantasy live on for another like 50 years in the dominant before people are like, hey, I want to see something else. Though I do think it's a little sad because such a tone has been set. People, due to this like lack of interest in making super new settings, I feel like that's where we lose some of like the Wild West charm of people just coming up with wild things. And even when people do come up with wild things, it seems like it always just gets diverted back into some kind of mainstream once a company gets a hold of it. Fallout is a really good example of this. Like the ghouls in Fallout used to be these like hideous, monstrous creatures that were heavily mutated, but by Fallout 4 in the show, they're just like regular looking people that kind of have Deadpool skin, and that's the most that you get out of it. A lot of the same is kind of almost happened in Lord of the Rings, to be honest. Elves and dwarves had this like super deep lore within Lord of the Rings, and now people just take them and throw them in anything, and there's like no lore at all. They're just like, I just want people with pointy ears, and I like the short guys, and caves gold are cool, and there we go. Fantasy. Everybody claps. 10 out of 10. But share your thoughts below. I'm curious what other people think on this across the internet. Thanks for watching the video. If you're here until the end, please like and subscribe. It's appreciated. I am going to try to grow this channel into some kind of community. I know I'm an early YouTuber, so I'm probably making a lot of mistakes. Let me know what they are in the comments. But thanks for watching.